Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of Direct Inject, the crossover series between Shmup Junkie and myself. This video will be on my channel, and today we're talking all about Spriggan, a really cool shmup that I've recently kind of got my eyes on after playing MUSHA. So I thought it'd be best to begin by getting a little bit of a history from Shmup Junkie because you have much more familiarity with the PC engine, and that's why I've wanted to get you on this episode because that's a little bit outside my wheelhouse, so it'd be really cool to get your insight on this. So when did you first come across Spriggan?
Pretty much how I came across all my PC Engine games that I was playing at the time. I rented them. It wasn't that easy to get. Obviously, they didn't sell them all over the place. I was lucky enough to live near an import store. So I'd probably mentioned it on my channel before. My thing was I would ride my bike to the import store every weekend, or just about every weekend, and find a new game to rent. And that's how I came across most of the shmups and other PC Engine games I played. And that's how I came across Spriggan, along with other CD games. Luckily, they're region-free, so I could use a Japanese card and an American system and play all the PC Engine games on it.
That is really cool, because growing up, I had never even heard of the PC Engine, and I did have a Genesis, I had a SNES, I was aware of the gaming world, but never heard of the PC Engine until much later in life. And so, yeah, where exactly was this import place as far as, was this specializing in gaming, or did it have just like random stuff from Japan? How did that work exactly?
It was a game store. It was actually called Japan Video Games. Real creative, right?
To the point. It's like tobacco shop, you know, to the point.
Yeah, exactly. I lived in West Hollywood. It was a big Russian community, and it was in Studio City, so it wasn't that far away. I could probably ride my bike there in less than an hour. Maybe it wasn't close, but it was worth it. So I, when I couldn't get driven, I just ride my bike there for 30, 45 minutes, and you just walk in, and there's this huge glass case. You just peruse all the new stuff, and even it kind of floors me now because you can't even find something like that these days, where you could just walk in and have an import store that rents all these, whether, I guess import games aren't as popular as they used to be back then.
Right, yeah.
Now PS4, Xbox, Switch games, yeah, sure, there's some Japanese games that don't come out here, but it's pretty global. Back then, it was completely different. I'm sure you remember that.
Oh, yeah. Yes, I do remember cutting the tabs on the Super Nintendo to put the Japanese carts inside. Did you ever do that?
No, because I didn't have a Super Nintendo, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, I thought it was cutting edge there. But I wanted to also just paint a mental picture of this, because I remember when I went and rented Nintendo games from a shop, it was like a pawn shop / jewelry store / video game store. So it had like bars all over it, people probably out there doing drugs behind the back, and I'd come in this little kid looking for Super Nintendo games. I was kind of putting my mental picture there. Or was it more up and up, something like a Blockbuster or something like that?
No, it was a small place. I mean, all these were like little holes in the wall. So it was part of a plaza, like a plaza with a whole bunch of different things. There's probably I don't remember exactly what was there, but I'm sure they had a couple restaurants, and it was almost across the street from Universal Studios. It's really close in that area.
Oh, wow.
But it was a little plaza, and it was up on the second floor, and it was just the routine. I just park my bike, lock it up, walk up there, and spend, time talking to the people that work there, perusing the games, and see what I wanted to play next. And that's how I ended up playing all of those different shmups, is I couldn't buy them all, but you just rent one for a weekend or like 3 days and then return it.
So what was the initial impression of Spriggan the first time you ever played it?
Wow. Well, the initial impression was definitely graphically the first thing you notice is, wow, these graphics are amazing, especially because it was a regular Turbo CD game. This was before the Super CD system was available, or at least as far as I remember. And a lot of the Turbo CD games, they didn't have the extra RAM yet, so they couldn't take advantage of a lot of the things that the later games did. So I really hadn't seen many games that looked that good. I mean, now that you've played it, it almost looks like a Super Nintendo game, as far as the color palette. Like, you just look and you're like, wow, this is impressive. And that's after having played MUSHA on, the Mega Drive and other systems. It's just a beautiful game.
Yeah, and speaking of MUSHA, that's actually an interesting segue, because how I first found out about Spriggan was I got my Mister. This is kind of a funny story. So I got my Mister to play the Dodonpachi Core beta when it very first came out, but the beta wasn't quite ready yet, and I was under the impression that I had to have the RAM card to play it, and I didn't have the RAM card. So basically, I had about a week or two there where I had my Mister, but I couldn't play Neo Geo or Super Nintendo. I could basically just play a few things, one of them being Genesis games, so I thought, alright, better play a Genesis shmup while I'm waiting. So I picked MUSHA, and I actually had played MUSHA a little bit before that, and for whatever reason, I didn't quite take to it the first time I played it. And then I played it the second time around, and I think when I found out you could speed up your ship by pressing start and pressing left to right and speeding it up, that's when the game really clicked for me. I have a whole video about this where I talked about how much I ended up loving MUSHA and finding a score rollover glitch and all this good stuff. But after I finished playing it, I was like, I kind of want to play the next game in the series, and so I was looking around, and it turned out that Spriggan is the next game, so here we are.
Or at least it was supposed to be. When I read some of the interviews, they wanted to make another MUSHA, but they couldn't make it MUSHA because it wasn't for Sega. So for whatever reason, they couldn't make another game for Sega at the time, and they ended up making it for Naxxitsoft and PC Engine. So they couldn't call it MUSHA, and they couldn't use the same themes. They didn't have the license to do that. But it's very, very similar. So it's like they made a MUSHA sequel, but it's not a MUSHA sequel. There's no connection story-wise. It's a completely different game, but the designer's the same. Was Kazuyuki Nakashima did both. He was the main designer on both games, and you can tell they look so similar. Even your main character.
Your mech is like the same thing.
Yeah, like you think you're playing MUSHA, but you're not. It's a completely different game.
It kind of reminds me a little bit of when Paper Mario came out, because they wanted to make a sequel to Mario RPG, but it's like, Square's not behind this anymore. So it's like, all right, let's make Paper Mario. But I think Spriggan is much closer to MUSHA, where you could convince me, if I didn't know that history, I would just assume it was the sequel to MUSHA completely.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I always kind of saw it that way. And then later when Den and Aleste came out, or Robo Aleste in the US, for whatever reason, I didn't quite take to that game as much. It's okay, but I didn't like it anywhere near as much as I like MUSHA, or Spriggan for that matter. So in my mind, Spriggan was the closest game to it as far as aesthetics and just the way the game looked and played. Even though it is a different game, it's almost like a cross between MUSHA, and it's got some Super Aleste in it.
Yeah, exactly.
Raizing lasers. It's there's a lot of differences, but from a design perspective, they just look very similar.
Yeah, and I almost feel like a lot of the changes are sort of an evolution of what they were doing with MUSHA. For instance, MUSHA's power-up system, as fun as it is, it's also pretty jank and can really get you in some nasty positions sometimes. And I think Spriggan has a much better system where after you die, you lose your little option power-up bomb things, whatever you want to, items, and you can pick them back up or pick some of them up, and kind of like in Garegga and later Raizing games. So I do like this system of the power-ups a lot more in MUSHA, or in Spriggan, as opposed to MUSHA. So I almost saw it as just a natural evolution rather than having to be a forced change or anything like that.
At first, it was almost confusing, to be honest, with the color orbs. Like, it took a while and a bit of playing just to figure out what combinations do what and in what order.
Yeah.
It can be confusing for someone playing it first, and it's not until you've played it for quite a bit where you really start to pick up on like what colors you want, what you don't, what you pass up on, and things like that. In addition to the mechanic where you don't want to waste all these orbs, and it gives you so many, so you bomb a lot. You have so many bombs. You're constantly bombing. You see one you're going to pick up, you can just drop one and then you just pick it up again, because why waste it?
Yeah, and it's also interesting too, because this comes up in a lot of these compile games I felt like so far, where sometimes you want to avoid them just because you don't want to mess up your current configuration. Like, my favorite configurations are blue yellow or blue red. I feel like those are just really powerful combinations there. So if I see a green floating around, I'm like, I'm going around that.
Yeah, a lot of the greens in general, like, I never really used them a lot. And different parts of the game have better combinations, just like any game.
Yeah.
So for the first half of the game, I usually stick with, certain colors that are fun and I like. And it's not as difficult, so I can kind of mess around. And then once I get further in, even in my video that I recorded, like, there's a point at like 14 minutes where I purposefully just drop, two of that I have, even though there's nobody in my way, because I want to switch out to a completely different loadout before I get to the boss. And like for the second half of the game, basically.
Yeah, and you were speaking earlier about the history of this game where they're sort of forced to change the IP into Spriggan rather than MUSHA. And I was really interested because you made that whole history of compile video, which was a smash hit in the world of shmup videos for sure. So I was wondering if you had any additional insights as far as the history of this game, as far in the lineage of compile.
Well, as far as the history of the game, what can I say about it, really? I already mentioned that, like I said, they wanted to make another MUSHA, and they couldn't, so it ended up being Spriggan. And part of that was the fantasy theme, is they couldn't keep the theme. So I remember reading an interview that they specifically went with a fantasy theme, not because, we think a fantasy theme is really cool. It's because they needed to do something different. It couldn't be the same, like, authentic, feudal Japan type of theme that MUSHA was, because it'd be too similar. So that was one of the reasons. It's funny because then they continued with the fantasy theme. I'm sure we'll talk about it later, where they went into Sorcerer Striker, and then it kind of carried over to that. So that part of it was interesting. The most interesting history to me was that a lot of the programmers didn't have any experience with the PC Engine yet, or at least some of the programmers working on Spriggan. So I remember reading an interesting interview where when they were first told that they were doing a PC Engine game, I think it was Toyama, the main programmer, that thought, oh God, PC Engine, this is going to be sad. How are we going to, make the game that we want to make on this? Because he didn't know the hardware. He just, it's an 8-bit system. But once he actually started working on it, he realized what it could do. He didn't, he saw that the color palette was pretty impressive. It was pretty much Super Nintendo level color palette as far as on-screen colors. And he realized that it had a really fast processor. Pretty much the processor on the PC Engine on the Mega Drive run at almost the same megahertz. So it's actually a really fast system, and it can do a lot of colors on screen at the same time. Its only limitation was it was an 8-bit CPU versus 16. And as you see, he in the interview, he specifically said that he became a really big fan of the PC Engine once he got to work with it. And I thought what they did was really impressive, especially for a regular CD game and the limited RAM that it had.
Yeah, I mean, so what's crazy about that is that before you gave that whole history and summary of the PC Engine's compatibility, I would have assumed, just by comparing Spriggan to MUSHA, that the PC Engine was more powerful than the Genesis, simply by the graphical presentation between the two. It feels to me that Spriggan is better than MUSHA as far as its graphical design, what you're seeing on screen, definitely the color palette, as you're saying. So that really surprises me to hear that in some senses, or maybe in the biggest sense, the Genesis is a more powerful machine.
Yeah, there's like a give and take. The Genesis had, multiple layers of parallax that they could do, and the PC Engine doesn't. And then with the advent of the Super CD system and more RAM, they were able to fake a lot of parallax. So a lot of the later PC Engine Super CD games have a lot of parallax, but it's not really parallax. It looks like it, because they're just using an excessive amount of RAM to simulate the parallax. It doesn't do it natively like the Genesis did. So there's some things they couldn't do with it. And that's one of the things that's so impressive about MUSHA, is there's so many different layers of things going on. It's really, really cool.
Especially the cloud stage with the lightning, and that one's my favorite.
Versus, on Spriggan, where they couldn't do quite as much of that. But again, like you said, it looks impressive. Kind of like why people assume the Super Nintendo was more powerful, because some of the games look so beautiful because of all the on-screen colors that they could do, even though processing power-wise, that wasn't the case.
Yeah, so that's interesting to hear this whole Sega copyright issue, because I'm sure Sega went on to really take advantage of this IP and to make lots of feudal Japanese shmups in their future. I mean, I'm sure that happened. But it also explains the graphical presentation of this game. And there's something I put in my little notes here, because when I was playing through it today, I was thinking, this game seems a little bit confused as far as what theme it wants to present to you, because you'll be going through some stages, and like the opening stage, very fantasy oriented, and you can definitely see, as you're saying, the Mahou or the Sorcerer Striker foreshadowing how that's going to lead into those games. And there are stages in this game that sort of foreshadow that. Then there's other stages where you're in a life force stage inside some kind of animal or whatever it is. Like, it feels very much like Life Force. And then the later stages It feels like, hey, let's throw in some cyberpunk here. The graphical theming of the game is pretty all over the place. It sort of works, but that makes a lot more sense now as to why it was so kind of chaotic with the graphical themes, because maybe in their heart they wanted to do more like sci-fi stuff. So they're like, okay, how much sci-fi can we sneak in this without Sega suing us or something? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, they were cool with Sega, so I mean, I don't think they wanted to step on anyone's toes. I mean, Compile had a better relationship with Sega than they had with any other console developer. That's why they made so many games for them.
And we spoke about this a little bit, and I wanted to kind of get your take on this next issue, because it's something I'm thinking about making a video here in the future, and you're the person I think that had really great insight, being a big fan of both these consoles. So, from your perspective, if you were to lay them out, which do you prefer, the PC Engine or the Genesis? Which piece of hardware would you have, if you had to hang on to one and say goodbye to the other, which one do you think you prefer?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess that should be an easy answer. I grew up with the PC Engine, and I have the most nostalgia for most of the games. So for me personally, I'd have to stick with my PC Engine because that's what I loved and that's what I grew up with. Regardless of, me really enjoying a lot of Mega Drive games and Genesis games. And it's not a matter of, it's about the games. It's not about the hardware. We could talk about, the pros and cons of the PC Engine, and Genesis.
Library-wise.
People love to, bench race like that, but it's about the games. So for me personally, the PC Engine had a ton of shmups, like, an
insane amount.
Like over 100, like an obscene amount.
You know how it has a lot of shmups? This is how you can tell. When you look at like mainstream, what are the best games on the system? If they put shmups on those lists, the system has a lot of shmups on it. Because, like Super Nintendo, even like Saturn sometimes, which is crazy. You'll look through those lists and there's barely any shmups on them. But you look those for the PC Engine, it's like full of shmups because they kind of have no choice, I think, to some degree.
The PC Engine was weird because it came out after the Famicom, before the Genesis. It was a natural extension of the Famicom, and a lot of the games were very similar. So it's just kind of like a souped-up 8-bit system in a lot of ways. So a lot of the genres continued through there. So it wasn't just the shmups that it had. I played a lot of RPGs on the Famicom, and the PC Engine had a ton of RPGs, so I really enjoyed that part of it. It had its share of platformers as well. But I think it was just the overall library. It was very uniquely Japanese. It was extremely popular in Japan.
Right, I heard that. Much more so than the Genesis or the Mega Drive or whatever the Japanese name is.
Absolutely. I mean, the Sega didn't do quite nearly as well in Japan. The PC Engine outsold it outright pretty much constantly. It even outsold the Nintendo for a while, for a couple of years there. When it just came out and it was at its peak, and anything that'll outsell the Famicom for a year or two, it's popular.
Yeah, and I wonder how much the CD aspect played into that, but I don't want to get too far off topic here. And that's interesting to hear though, because I assumed, just projected upon you, that you grew up with a Genesis and a PC Engine together, because I grew up with a SNES and a Genesis together, and it was interesting when I first started watching gaming YouTube how many people had these really bitter arguments between the two, where growing up, I think me and my friends and peers and family all came to the conclusion pretty steadily that the SNES was just much more of a beast than the Genesis, and I did have both systems. So I was wondering, did you not have a Genesis when you were growing up, or did you have a Genesis but your PC Engine was just where it was at?
No, I didn't, and I couldn't. I said we could only afford one system at the time. So I had the TurboGrafx, and eventually the Duo. A good friend of mine had a Genesis, and another friend had a Super Nintendo. So that's how we played. If we wanted to play Genesis, we were at their house. If they wanted to play the PC Engine games, they were at my house. And we always went back and forth, and we shared. So that's pretty much how it went.
Well, awesome. So for me, I'm really starting to get more and more into the PC Engine. And for instance, on my Mister, I'm finding myself booting it up much more often than the Genesis now. So yeah, I'm starting to turn that corner as well. I'm thinking maybe if you're into shmups, I like to compare. I wanted to compare them though, because I feel like they're very direct competitors to each other, even more so than the Genesis and the SNES, right? Like if you're into certain genres, the SNES is just where it's at. And then if you're into shmups, the Genesis just has it beat there. But the PC Engine and the Genesis, to me, seem much more like head-to-head. If you're into shmups, you could go either way, depending on what it is, what's appealing to you.
Yeah, and in your case, because you haven't played a lot of PC Engine games, it makes sense. You've played a lot of Mega Drive shmups, so now you're kind of discovering a lot of new shooters, shmups that are on the PC Engine. So you're pulled to it because, like, well, I haven't played this before. This looks cool. I'll check this out. I'll check that out. So there's a lot more to discover. But I say, in my mind, the PC Engine Genesis, I said the PC Engine came out earlier. The Genesis came out right afterwards, and it was definitely a more powerful piece of hardware. And when I originally just owned my TurboGrafx, at some point there were only so many games coming out for the TurboGrafx. It was only so popular in the US.
Yeah,
so definitely. I was starting to feel that. I was like, a little bit envious. It's like, when am I going to get another game? These games are okay, but even I was eyeing the Genesis, going, man, I'd love to have this. I'd love to be able to play all these games at my house, because it was leaving the TurboGrafx behind as far as the library, and I didn't know what else they would do with it. But the interesting thing, it's I guess a good comparison would be like the Tortoise and the Hare, or Tortoise and the Sonic, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. Or Sonic and Spriggan, I guess.
What happened was, it was originally left behind, but they built the PC Engine. It's a really brilliant piece of hardware because they made it extremely expandable. So with that expansion port, when they released that CD system and eventually the Super CD and then the RAM cart for it, it created an enormous opportunity. They actually ended up having more games in the end for the CD systems than they actually had for the HuCard. Like for the original PC Engine, it wasn't the Sega CD where there was an add-on, and it did okay.
I was going to mention that. Like Sega CD, I mean, can we be honest? It's kind of a dud. I never even bothered to get it. And I had a Genesis. I was like, well, what's the point? But it seems like on the PC Engine, that thing, the CD's popping.
Oh yeah, it was huge. I mean, and that's why it had such longevity, is they released the Super CD and then they released the RAM card. So it was just like the Saturn, where they have the cartridges with the RAM cards, and they pop it in and you get all this extra RAM. So once they did that with the Super CD, all of a sudden it leapfrogged over what the Genesis could do and even what the Super Nintendo can do. Like you look at Sapphire, for example, or, Rondo of Blood. So the later games, all of a sudden it had this huge longevity, and they released a ton of CD games. So it lasted from before the Genesis came out, like during the late Famicom years, and all the way through, like close towards the end. They just released a ton of games for it. I don't know what the number is. I don't know if it's like 500 or 4 something. Like it's a ridiculous amount.
Yeah, and you start to discover that when you get into shmups, where you're going through and you'll just start seeing, like Cotton. You look up Cotton and you'll say where it is. There's a PC Engine. You'll look up another game. Oh, there's a PC Engine. Like you're finding more and more, like there's just like floating around PC Engine ports of the games. If you're not that familiar with it, like I said, I had no idea this thing existed forever.
A lot of people did, and that's why I use that Tortoise and the Hare, because it's kind of an apt comparison where, toward the end, it just took off again, and it overtook the other consoles with the CD add-on and everything else what they were doing with it. So it caught up. And even though it fell behind initially because it was an older system with an older processor.
Yeah, definitely. So we've established Spriggan, we've established MUSHA. So for yourself, which would you prefer? Which one do you end up liking in the end? Do you like MUSHA or Spriggan better?
That's not actually a very hard question. I do like MUSHA better than Spriggan. I think MUSHA is a lightning in a bottle game. That's what I call it. It's one of those games where you get a crack team of like 4 or 5 people together, and you give them like 5-6 months to make a game, and they just come up with something amazing. And I like it most because it's kinetic. I like the gameplay more. I like the speed of it. And that's just the style of game I like. So it's not, the graphics are better here or the graphics are better there. I just enjoy coming back to it more and playing it more in the long run. Like I said, it's just one of those lightning in a bottle games where everyone's at the right place at the right time. You don't think they can make something great because the timeline is short, and they just come up with magic. It's the PC Engine would be Soldier Blade. It's the same thing. That's my favorite PC Engine game, and it's the same thing. It had a short development cycle. They only had like 4 to 6 months to make the game, and it came out amazing. And it's kind of the same thing with MUSHA, where everything just falls into place, and it's a great game.
Yeah, for myself, I'm a little bit more divided, where it's hard for me to choose which I like better. because I see some very strong pros and cons for each. The big pro for MUSHA, you nailed it there, is the kinetic, fast gameplay. It has a bit of a better game feel at times than Spriggan does. Spriggan can feel, especially the freaking Life Force stage, can feel a little bit slow-paced at times and a little bit like, hey, let you know, you guys should have cranked up the volume a bit here. But
got some pacing issues, yeah.
Yeah, but then there's other times where you're playing MUSHA and you get into these horrible like chain death scenarios, or some of the level design in the later parts of MUSHA, you're like, what the hell were they thinking here? So, and then the power-up system, I really prefer Spriggan's power-up system over MUSHA's with the items, and you can throw the bombs, and you can make little cool color combos, and
it's definitely more interesting from that perspective. It definitely does a more interesting power-up system than MUSHA does.
Yeah, so I'm really divided, honestly, on which I like better. I think probably MUSHA is the better game, but someone should go in there and ROM hack it a little bit and fix some of these things, and then it'd really shine. Go in there and switch up the power-up system a little bit. It is a bit of a shame that more people don't take that up, as much ROM hacking as people do with Genesis games. I mean, come on. Show MUSHA some love.
A big part of it is the music, too, I think, because the music in MUSHA is awesome, and as much as I like Spriggan, and so many PC Engine games have amazing soundtracks, I'm kind of lukewarm on the soundtrack of Spriggan. There are some stages that are really cool. Yeah, especially later stages like 7. The one in space that has an awesome soundtrack that's closer to MUSHA actually, and then others are very more laid back, almost like the soundtrack from Robo Alesta. So I don't get as into the music with Spriggan as I do with MUSHA, and that's a really big part of shmups. So that's probably a big reason why I like MUSHA more too.
Yeah, and this is where this segues really good into one of the main points of this video that I wanted to go over, which is the thing about Spriggan that I think gives it a little bit of extra bonus points for me that it probably doesn't deserve, is that I can just see so much of the DNA of Sorcerer Striker, Mahou, and the later Raizing titles within it. It feels like it's like the embryo of those games. MUSHA feels like it's like the blueprint. Like you could see those things in MUSHA, but in a very vague sense. And it's really interesting how you could almost, if there was like an evolutionary stage between the two, like Spriggan's like the exact middle point between MUSHA and Sorcerer Striker, where it's fantasy, but it's got steampunk, MUSHA stuff in there too. The soundtrack, like you're saying, at times can kind of go back to MUSHA's more metalish sounding soundtrack. Then other times it's like, hey, we're a fantasy game now, like when Sorcerer Striker. So it's like this weird teenage awkward phase between the two. But yeah, as far as the soundtrack goes, again, that's tough for me. That's tough for me because I don't think I'm as into the Genesis metal sounding soundtracks as many of my fellow shmuppers. I think they are cool, but I kind of do like the more Raizing, especially what they did with Garegga and Sorcerer Striker, where it's like this sort of funky, fantasy, weird soundtrack thing they got going. And at times, Spriggan delivers that. So again, it's a bit of a mixed bag for me there as far as which I prefer. I think more people would like MUSHA's soundtrack better. It's probably better composed, to be honest. The big one for me, though, is I'm not a huge fan of the Genesis sound. It's hard to explain exactly, but it doesn't quite have that bass that I like to hear. It's a little bit more tinny. But yeah, so I'm a little bit divided between those on the soundtrack. I think if someone did like a range of the MUSHA soundtrack where they busted out drums and guitars and basses, I'd probably like that better, though.
It's really weird with the Genesis. It was really good at mimicking the arcade conversions because a lot of the arcades use the very similar FM sound chip. So when you take, like Zero Wing and a lot of the other Toaplan games, they sound a lot more like Toaplan games on the Genesis because it's so much easier to do. They can duplicate that sound, and it's like with Genesis games, they either sounded great or they didn't.
Oh yeah.
You had to know how to work with the sound chip. So there are some games like Zeroing on the Mega Drive that just sound awesome. They have tons of bass. There's a lot of mid-range. It actually sounds better than the arcade, because they did such a great job with it. And I said the Genesis obviously has some games with amazing soundtracks like
Streets
Revenge of Shinobi
and all that stuff. Yeah.
Because they knew how to do it. So, they had some games with tons of like bass and mid-range. And then they had other games that just were too much or too grating, or they just didn't use the sound chip well. So it was kind of hit and miss, where PC Engine is definitely very, very melodic type of music. Overall, I preferred music on the PC Engine, not just the CD games, even the chip tunes. A lot of the Soldier games and Blazing Lasers sounded awesome. So I'm a fan of both. It's just very different. But whenever they needed to mimic an arcade board, that's where the Genesis really kind of stood out. A lot of the 12-line games, they were able to copy that sound where the PC Engine just couldn't do that.
Yeah, so I think, too, with me, I might be a little bit unusual because a lot of people that I talk with, it is interesting, the Genesis SNES divide. I would always go with the SNES. I like the sound of the SNES a lot more than the Genesis, so that probably will inform you as to why I probably like the sound of the PC Engine over the sound of the Genesis. Like I said, I don't dislike the Genesis or anything like that, but for me, I'm kind of stuck in the middle between which soundtrack I like better. So we covered the music, we covered the graphics. Let's go. We talked about the level design a little bit. I want to also touch back on the boss design and some of the other level design elements. So what do you like about Spriggan's boss or level design? What stands out to you?
The creativity. The biggest connection that I see between Spriggan and the first Raizing games, especially Sorcerer Striker, or I don't pronounce Mahou Daisakusen properly, so I just call it Sorcerer Striker because I'm not exactly how to pronounce it. But I see a lot of that there. So I like creativity in shmups. I like when the levels have variety, when there's always something new to look at, when there's something cool going on. So I don't mind the design being all over the place like that. And that stands out to me the most as far as graphically. It's extremely colorful. Like I said, it looks like a Super Nintendo game. And it's creative. Every level has something different. And as far as the bosses go, they look really cool.
Yeah.
And design-wise, they look cooler than the bosses in MUSHA. They're beautiful to look at, just like the game is. But as far as fighting them, they're what's the word I'm looking for? It's very easy to exploit a lot of them once you know how to play the game.
Yes, yeah.
If you look at my video, if especially the latter half of the game, there's a little bit of a balance issue there where I actually feel, especially on the harder difficulties, the first, like stage 2 and stage 3, like that middle range, are where the hardest levels are, and some of the bosses. And then once you get further into the game, it actually gets easier, and I can very easily exploit some of those bosses later in the game. As far as the gameplay side of things, now I've never played it on ultra hard,
ultra unfair, or whatever it's called.
Yeah, so I haven't tried that. Who knows what it does, but at least on hard, I can pretty much waltz through the second half of the game where there's a couple levels there in between where you got to be real careful and can mess up and lose a life here and there.
Yeah, I definitely agree 100% there. MUSHA has a different difficulty problem in that you can kind of breeze through a lot of MUSHA until you hit like 2 sections, and then the game absolutely crushes you without mercy if you have the slightest mistake. Spriggan is much more forgiving in that regard, but like you're saying, I agree. The difficulty of the game is all over the place. Some stages are earlier on are harder than they seem they need to be, and then some of the later stages you can really exploit the boss. Like you can get the homing item and just kind of hang out up top of the screen and blast them with the homing item, and they're helpless basically. So yeah, I definitely agree there. I think overall the difficulty and level design of MUSHA is on a fundamental basis better. It's just a question of if they had just messed around with that power-up system a little bit, it would have really helped out. I don't know if you ever played MUSHA in the higher difficulties where you get that stupid section in the ship. I can't remember. It's like the second to last or last stage. There's that ship full of like cannons. And if you get clipped on that, it's over. Like reset your game because you're dead.
Yeah, I don't think I played MUSHA on hard. I watched your video on it, but I don't know if I ever did or tried. With Spriggan, I played on hard by default because it's just too easy on the normal.
Yes.
You play it on hard, and at least, it gets easier later, but at least there's somewhat of a challenge until you kind of figure the game out.
And I do think MUSHA's game design is better in that Spriggan has some real, like, Mega Man 2, oh, I got you type moments, especially in the Life Force stage where you basically have to memorize what happens beforehand. Otherwise, a worm just pops out of the screen and murders you. It's like, all right, cool. Yeah, definitely. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about Caravan Mode because I messed around with it a little bit, but I haven't put too much time into it. And you're a connoisseur of Caravan Modes, as I understand, so...
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, I didn't play a lot of them when I was younger. I wasn't really into like the competitive aspect of it, and I didn't check out the modes. But it wasn't until I was older where I really started messing with them and realized how fun they were. Because for me, caravans are fun when they're in a group. When you're playing against other people, if you're just kind of competing against yourself, it's really not that different than any other high score mode.
Yep.
But they're extremely fun when they're played a certain way, which is why I've been having those caravan events on my Discord they've been real popular and people are really enjoying them. So I'll keep doing them. But it's just that camaraderie of playing together with a group of like 20, 30 other people. But really, the Spriggan was the first caravan game by Naxxatsoft. So caravans were big. It was a Hudson thing. They did it on the Famicom first, and then it transitioned to the PC Engine. So Hudson always had their caravan series. Naxxat wanted to compete with them, so they started their own called the Summer Carnival.
Right,
and Spriggan
yes.
did 3 of them. So Spriggan was their first Summer Carnival series game with a time attack and a score attack. But really, a caravan mode is just a very condensed, short 2-minute or 5-minute mode where you score as high as you can. It's just very different to play those modes than it is to try to get a high score in a main game like playing, Dodonpachi or any other game for high score because they're so condensed.
Yeah.
You would think there's only so much you can figure out and do in 2 minutes of game time, but 2 minutes is a lot.
Yeah,
And,
especially because, as I understand in caravan modes, is that the better you do, the more stuff you kill, the more stuff that spawns. So it compounds on itself, right?
Yeah, so what they do with caravan modes is they purposefully bake in all these different bonuses and secrets that you have to find and figure out that you wouldn't just normally know. So part of it is you need to kill as quickly as possible for the most part. That's how it was at the time. Just to be able to reach certain bonuses, you have to play perfectly, like with 100% efficiency. And then there's also all kinds of bonuses that throw into the stages. So they may have hidden blocks like at 10 different locations, and you have to make sure you hit every one because every one you get, once you get all 10, it gives you a big bonus at the end. Or you'll have a situation where if you kill 2 or 3 enemies right simultaneously, you'll get an extra big bonus that way. So there's all these little things to figure out, and to put it all together into 2 minutes and play it fast enough, the very, very top scorers, it's not easy to do.
Oh, yeah. Crimson Clover actually has a time attack mode like that, which is really fun and really interesting. So I did have a taste of that, even in the world of Bullet Hells. And Fire Lancer, the cool thing about Fire Lancer, whenever it gets released, is the whole game is basically a caravan mode, which is insane. And they had a really fun scoring competition for it a while back that it was like you're saying, you play this, it's like 2 or 3 minutes of gameplay, but it gets so intense and fun, and I'm a big fan of it, so I'll probably start playing a little bit more into caravan modes if I can find the time for it. But as far as in the world of caravans, where would you put Spriggan's? Was it well done, or were there issues?
Well, the real question is, I've only spent so much time with it, so I probably can't say it's good or bad, because with a caravan mode, until you really put a ton of time into it, like dozens of hours,
right? Yeah.
You really don't know. You don't see the nuance. You don't know it. I've only played it for, let's say, an hour or two, so I can say, oh, it was all right, but these other caravans had way more nuance, but I could have missed half of it.
Yeah.
So you don't know. Whereas I just know that the very, very popular caravans were like Soldier Blade and Superstar Soldier, and of course Rekka, which was Naxxatsoft. That was the last one that Naxxatsoft released, and that's incredibly deep and incredibly difficult. Obviously, you're familiar with Rekka too.
Yep. So that's a great point, because I wanted to talk about the general scoring system of the game, and I have the exact same impression of that as you're describing here, where to me it's this giant question mark. I tried to research it, I tried to look into it. This game is an enigma as far as the scoring in it, because I couldn't really find many scoring replays. The highest scoring replay I found reference to was a good old Pericles, and we all know what happened to his channel, so that's gone. So I couldn't even look at that. And I was looking for any kind of like strategy wikis on this thing or strategy discussion. I mean, it's just a big question mark as far as my research. And
yeah, and are you talking about for the main game or for the caravan mode?
The main game.
Oh. Yeah, I don't even know how involved the scoring is in the main game, simply because I don't know how seriously they took it. If you look, there's really no leaderboard. There's
Nothing.
no way it doesn't keep track of your score. unless you make a note and you take a picture when you're done, you don't even know what your score was.
Right.
And that was actually very common with console games back then. Everything is about scoring now with shmups. But you go back far enough, that just wasn't the case for a lot of games, especially console games. It just wasn't about that. So I'm sure it has a scoring system. It might have a good one. I don't know anything about it. I never kept track of my score unless it was the Caravan Mode in any of those games, because that's why they made the Caravan Mode. If you wanted to do score attacks and you wanted something really, really involved and something you could sink your teeth into and spend dozens of hours figuring it out, that's what that mode was for.
Well, it's interesting that I think it's good that we're reviewing this on the heels of Aleste 3 coming out, or Aleste 3 coming out. I can't remember how you pronounce it, but because that game is like a really good counterpoint to this one, where even though it has all kinds of different modes and stuff, the arcade mode has a very clear scoring system, and as I was playing it, I could kind of get a feel for, okay, so you want to manipulate the power-ups this way, you want to do this and that to get scores. But in Spriggan, it kind of reminded me of MUSHA a little bit, honestly, where it's just like, kill stuff, that's how you get points. And I wasn't sure exactly how the meta could evolve. And again, I couldn't find any references or people breaking the game, which is unusual. Because with MUSHA, I don't know if people know this unless you saw my MUSHA video. Right now, I'm pretty sure I have the highest recorded MUSHA score out there because someone found a counter stop in MUSHA. There's like this counter stop glitch. And so I kind of reverse engineered that, and I did it. But for the video, I wanted to get the clear, so I was like, okay, I won't, because when you do the counter stop normally in MUSHA, it freezes the game crashes, and then you just say, okay, I counter stopped and it crashed. But I was like, well, I don't want to just crash it. I want to make it interesting for the viewers here. So what I did was I went right up to the counter stop, and then I stopped. Then I played the rest of the game, and assuming that I would come out with a lower score than the counter stop, right? Well, it turns out if you clear MUSHA right underneath the counter stop, you get a score rollover because it gives you this huge point bonus at the end, but it doesn't crash the game. So you'll actually roll over the score dial, which is pretty cool. And I don't think anyone else on video has done that yet. But so I was looking for.
I watched your video on that. It was really cool. Obviously, I didn't know about it. And it doesn't surprise me one bit because Compile was a console developer. They didn't make arcade games. So that's why, scoring wasn't their top priority. And it kind of makes. And the reason GG 3 does is because they're catering to modern gamers. Now everybody expects a good scoring mode. They can't release a game like that and have, a BS scoring system and, it won't fly. So I think they all realized that, and M2 realized that. So they wanted to put a good scoring system in it. But back then, I can totally see why MUSHA and Spriggan and Blazing Lasers and all those games.
Thunder Force, yeah.
Thunder Force. It was about survival. And maybe be getting a one critic clear, but the score was, for you to keep on your own, and that was about it.
Yeah. So I was really hoping to find some broken, stupid thing in Spriggan to exploit for the video, but I couldn't find anything. I'm sure something's in there somewhere that you can do, but to me, the scoring system, unfortunately, is a big question mark. I could never crack it as far as the meta of the scoring system, because it's just such an unexplored game in that aspect. Unfortunately.
Yeah, a lot of games of that era are, and a lot of PC Engine games are, and it's hard to find just any info on them at all. And that's why these Caravan events are so cool, is because if we now did a Caravan event for Spriggan, for example, and we got 30, 40 people playing and some really people in there, we'd see some insane scores and all kinds of things, and all of a sudden all that information would be out there again, and we'd get all these achievements like we've done for other games, like Omega Blast that we did on Mega Drive. We created these insane scores that nobody even thought was possible in that game. And we do the same thing with Spriggan. And that's how it goes. And then the info will be out there as long as I document it or somebody documents it and makes a video on it.
Yeah,
until it's lost history again.
Right, like the score rollover in MUSHA. That's like exactly what you're talking about. So, the final question for you is, on your list of Compile, where does Spriggan land? Because you made the Compile history. You're very familiar with the company. And I consider you like an expert on them. So where does it land?
It lands below the top tier of Compile games for me. So if I were to say my absolute favorite Compile games that I play the most, MUSHA would be on that list. Blazing Lasers Gunhead would be on that list. Power Strike 2 would be on that list. That's a incredibly impressive game for the Sega Master System. And even though it's older and it's not as crazy graphically because it's an 8-bit game,
Yeah. Was
it's
that
a
was that
really,
on the
really
collection?
well-done game.
Was that on the collection?
It is.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah, I mean, and you play and you're like, this is a Master System game? That's insane. So, those are three of like just overall the best designed, ones I can just go back to and play over and over again. Gunhead just simply for nostalgia for me. And then right below that, I would put like Super Elastic, because that's also a really good game.
Yeah.
For the Nintendo, it's not as much my speed because I'm not into the obstacle-based gameplay as much.
Right, I agree.
Where you're dealing with that. But it kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? It almost like supersedes itself. It's, I'm not into those kind of games, but it's so well done.
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
It's fast and fun to play that I can play it anyway. So I can recognize that Super Elastic is a great game despite it not being, normally my speed. So I would put it right up there just below my favorites. And then right below that, I would put Spriggan. So it's kind of like it's a really good game, but it's not up there with like the top echelon of my favorite compile games.
Yeah, I'd probably agree. I don't have as much familiarity with as many compile games, but from the ones that I've played, I would say it's not as good as MUSHA, unfortunately, but it's not that much further down because it just has this potential that I see within it. It's like, oh, this is where Sorcerer Striker came from, and it has so many great ideas in there. They just haven't quite been fleshed out. They haven't quite realized their potential, but I still got to give it credit for sort of bringing those into the conversation. So for me, yeah, I could see it landing in kind of the mid-tier. I'd probably put it up there on top the mid-tier area just because I love it so much as far as the visuals and the graphics and the design concepts and the power-up system I'm a big fan of. But like the level design really hurts it in a lot of places, especially that stupid Life Force stage. But yeah,
I'm a music when it comes to shmups. So I'm all about the music. So that's part of what keeps me coming back to a game over and over again.
Yeah.
So, and because I'm not as hot on the music on Spriggan, except a couple stages which I really enjoy, versus Power Strike 2, MUSHA, and Blazing Lasers. So I'm like, I just kind of look at it. Which games do I come back to the most? Which ones do I want to play the most? And then I kind of tier it down that way. So Spriggan is a really cool game, and I play it, but I don't come back to it as often as the other ones.
I think that's maybe the key to maybe our different opinions, because I'm much more of a visual guy than an audio guy for shmups. Even though I love music, I'm really into music. But as far as like in-game music, as long as it isn't unbearable, I'll take what I can, and I do enjoy a really good soundtrack, of course. But what really gets me hyped is just beautiful visuals, eye-catching color palettes, all that stuff, crazy boss designs. Like visual presentation goes a long way for me. So then maybe that's why I put it a little bit higher on my list there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, I'm kind of the opposite. I love graphics too, but for me, if the music is great, I'll keep coming back to it over and over again. Even games that I'm tired of, or I've played so many times I can kind of sleepwalk through it, like Lords of Thunder, because it's I can just breeze through that game, and it's a really cool game, but I've played it so much. And what keeps me coming back are those soundtracks. I can just listen to it over and over again. So it's just like, and it's like going to a rock concert. So you get into it and you can just keep listening to it, even though you've heard the song 1,000 times.
Yeah, for me, kind of like I love Donanpachi, but many occasions I'll just mute that bad boy or turn it down to the point where I can only hear the sound effects and like play my own music over the top of it, because I cannot take 4 tracks repeating for 5 hours anymore. So yeah. Well, awesome. Thanks so much for coming on. I think you all will enjoy this episode of Direct Inject. The next one will be on Shmup Junkie's channel. Check out his channel in the video description. Sub to him, of course. What's wrong with you? Sub to him.
I just want to say that the Caravan events have been extremely popular on the channel. Everyone's loved it, and everyone we just get more and more and more people coming in on them. They're a ton of fun. Last one, we had over 40 people join in, just working together and high scoring. So if this sounds like something you'd like, if it's interesting, you want to get into a Caravan score competition, check out my channel, check out my Discord, and join us, because you're more than welcome.
And let me end this video by thanking my patrons: 72 PTC Water, Adam Pearson, Adrian Reyes, Akshay Wadkar, Dingo, Andy Cap, Anthony A, Ben Wynn, Borgie22, Brian Shiver, Corio, Danielle Savage, Delta Tango 6, Disco Stas Leia, Dominic NG, Eric H, Full Set, Retro Shmupper, Geriatric Danmaku, Hausu, Ilya, Kiwi, JLab, JB RPG, Joe Angelo, Gameboy Guru, K, Malays, Mark Toms, Maz, Meher Calendrian, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, 9, Okla Kugels, Philip Mason, Portal 63, Ram Q, Raul, Real Skeen, Sketchy Raccoon, TRM, Sugumo, Yishi, Plasmo, and Utakaya. Thanks for watching.